Open a book and open up your mind. Open a book and open up your mind. Open a book and open up your mind. Open a book and open up your mind.
Good morning, Dragonettes. Tarynn here. It's a cold, gray, nippy day out there today. We've even got a little snow out there. Perfect day to cuddle up. I'm in my favorite chair with my Afghan in front of the heater, keeping warm. And you'll have to pardon me about my voice. I know it's a little scratchy today, but I've got some liquid refreshment to hopefully grease the wheels, and we can jump right into things. This is our fourth installment of Magic Casement by Dave Duncan. And we've already had the inciting incident. More than Enos buying the silk, I think seeing the god is what really gets things going in the story, because everything else follows that incident. Enos seeing the god is actually one of my favorite scenes. I really love it. I love the description. I love what happens. I love Mother Unanini getting it. And as far as she goes, Mother Unanini can't stand her. Glad we're not going to see her again. But I will get right into it without further ado. Cuddle up with a nice warm Afghan or your favorite kitty in your favorite chair. Sit back and enjoy. And here we go. Enos heard teeth chattering and realized they were hers. I shall return the silk, God. No need for that. She looked up in astonishment and had to close her eyes at once against the sudden agony. You mean Father will buy it for me? The god laughed. It was simultaneously a quiet chuckle and an awe-inspiring explosion of vast, immortal enjoyment. It should have been deafening, and it should have echoed around and around the tiny chapel, but it did neither. That and many others. We do not say that you deserve this. We are only making a prophecy. There are hard times ahead for you, Inosalan, but you may find a happy ending if you choose the good. Now, there's a natural kink in that. Everybody automatically wants to choose the good, but sometimes what's good isn't always easy or convenient, of course. She said, What must I do, God? And was astounded to realize that she was questioning them. Seek to find the good, they said. And above all, remember love. If you do not trust in love, then all will be lost. And they had gone, without waiting for a reply or thanks, without demanding praise or prayers, neither worship nor ritual. The god had vanished. 5. Mother Unanini uttered a great wail and prostrated herself completely. I can relate to that. I can imagine that I would probably do that myself. Enos considered that procedure for a moment and then decided that it was not called for, nor did the chaplain seem to want to continue their earlier conversation. Come to think of it, old Fishy Breath Unanini had been most divinely snubbed and put down. The god had made their appearance to save Enos from Mother Unanini's spite. Yeah, I can imagine she feels pretty bad right now, I would too. But of course Enos doesn't have to. Feeling very calm and pleased now, Enos rose and walked out of the chapel, blinking at the bright sunshine. That was nothing compared to the brightness of a god. She had seen a god. Most people lived all their lives without such an honor. What a pity she had been wearing her dowdy brown worsted, she thought, and then scolded herself for such improper vanity. Nevertheless, she decided to go back to her room and change. Once she was looking a little more regal and princessy, she would see what she could do to patch things up with Aunt Cade and the man who was obviously not a sorcerer. And she must show Father the silk that he was going to buy for her. That and many others, the god had said. Most curious. She had seen a god. It would be a topic of general interest at dinner. I think more than just dinner. She headed toward her chamber, walking with her head very high, feeling elevated. Yes, elevated. It was as if she weighed nothing at all and had to reach her toes down to touch the ground as she walked. If she passed anyone on the way, she didn't notice. She came to the stairs and began to float up them. But by the time she struggled to the top, her mood had changed totally, and she seemed to weigh as much as the whole castle. She dragged her reluctant carcass up the last few steps and could hardly find the strength to open the door. She staggered in, and the first thing she saw was herself in the mirror, her hair still all smeared with cobwebs, and her face as white as a seagull, with the seagull's round bright eyes. And behind her reflection, her father was sitting on her bed, waiting for her. She saw an expression of impatience change instantly to alarm. He jumped up and held out his arms, and then he was hugging her tight and holding her head as she buried her face in his soft velvet collar and began to sob. Still holding her tight, he sat her down beside him on the bed and held her for a long time as she sobbed and sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. At last she was able to find one of her mother's linen handkerchiefs and wipe her aching eyes and blow her nose and even somehow manage a small smile. Her father regarded her with a worried frown. He was wearing a deep blue robe, and he looked very regal with his short brown beard, very comforting and reassuring. A little tired, perhaps. His velvet collar was stained with tears and cobwebs, and she dabbed at it with her handkerchief, feeling stupid now and childish. "Well," he said, "you haven't had a good cry like that in a long time, young lady. What provoked all that?" "I would say what provoked that is the inciting incident. So let's see how things unfold. Where to begin?" "I thought he was a sorcerer." "Sagorn?" Her father smiled. "No, he's a very learned man, but he's not a sorcerer. I don't think it would be possible to eavesdrop on a sorcerer, my princess." Then his smile faded. "He's also a very private man, Enos. He does not like to be spied on. How much did you hear?" "You said you would not marry me off to Calcor or Angilki." She paused and thought carefully. "I didn't understand the rest, father. I'm sorry." "Sorry?" He laughed ruefully. "You realize you almost burned down the castle." "No! How could I? Oh, no! The urn?" "The urn," he agreed. "That disgusting, smelly, hideous old thing your aunt is so absurdly attached to. The oil went everywhere. Luckily, young Kell was quick-witted enough to throw a rug over the flames. Well, don't do it again." "And that's all? All that weeping because you thought you'd met a sorcerer?" She wiped her eyes again and fought down an insane desire to laugh. "No. Then I met a god." "What? You're serious?" She nodded and told him. He believed her, listening solemnly, and he stared at the floor and tugged his beard for a while, looking worried. "Well, I'm not surprised you're upset," he said at last. "Meeting gods must be a very scary experience. I fear it means trouble. We must discuss it with Sagorn. But I'm not sorry to hear about Mother Unanini, I must say." He glanced sideways at her, his eyes twinkling. "I can't stand the woman either. But don't tell anyone I said that." "You can't?" She was astonished at both his words and his conspiratorial grin. Not regal at all. He shook his head. "It's very hard to find a suitable, well-educated chaplain willing to live in a place like Krasnagarinus." "There's nothing wrong with Krasnagar," she protested. He sighed. "Well, I agree with you, but many wouldn't. Now, what was all this about silk?" She jumped up and fetched the silk from where it lay beside the mirror. She shook it loose and draped it over her shoulder for him to see, and before he could speak, she hurriedly explained how the gold matched her hair and the bronze was just right for her skin and the green for her eyes. I was hoping you would buy it for my birthday, she finished hopefully. He shook his head and motioned for her to sit again. She dropped the silk, feeling her spirits drop with it. As she sat, he lifted a small leather box from the bed beside him. Yeah, of course he's gonna buy it. You know he's got to. I am giving you these for your birthday. He opened the lid and she gasped. Mother's jewels! Yours now. Pearls and rubies and emeralds, gold and silver. They're not a great fortune, he said, but they are all good pieces. Beauty, not riches. Some of them are very old. This belonged to Oliola, Iniso's wife. She was overwhelmed, listening with open mouth as he told her the history of some of the jewelry. Then she hugged him and wanted to start trying them on, but he closed the box. As for the silk, trouble. Yes, father? Where did you ever find something like that? Mr. Smailhorn's. I might have guessed, he smiled. How much? Well, more than I meant to pay, but you sound just like your mother, he said. How much? Where have I heard that one before? Enos bit her lip and whispered the terrible truth. What? He stared at her. Then he quickly turned away, and after a moment, she realized that he was laughing. Father? He looked around at her, and his laughter exploded aloud. He bellowed with laughter. Oh, Enos, my pet. Oh, princess. He laughed some more. She felt hurt, almost angry. Come, he said at last, still fighting down amusement that she did not understand. Come and meet Dr. Sagorn. Once it had been called the Queen's Room, but now it was His Majesty's study. Enos had not been in it very much recently, although it was almost the only place in the whole castle that could ever be classified as cozy in the winter. She preferred now to seek warmth and friendship in the kitchens mostly. The familiar chairs and sofa had not changed since her mother's time, but they suddenly registered on her as the furniture in her father's bedroom had done, old and shabby, and not regal. She was annoyed to see the long and bony form of Dr. Sagorn stretched out in her mother's favorite chair. He rose awkwardly and bowed to her, and she curtsied. She had insisted on changing and felt much better in her cypress green wool. It was too warm for this weather, but it did have a hint of padding, and it did make her look older. Yeah, once again, oh, that patting of the chest. It's been going on from time immemorial, I imagine. Keeping her gaze firmly on the threadbare rug, she apologized. He bowed again. And my apologies to you, Your Highness, for frightening you. She thought he could have put a little more conviction into the words. Your father and I were perhaps a little too trusting in not locking the bedroom door. The old blue eyes gleamed nastily. We put too much faith in that aversion spell. It must be wearing thin, I suppose, after so many centuries. Spell? Enos echoed. Sorcery? Did you not feel it? She thought you were a sorcerer, her father remarked, smiling as if that were a big joke. Alas, no. I should hardly go around looking like this if I were a sorcerer, now would I? Dr. Sagorn attempted to match her father's smile, but his angular face looked even more predatory when he did that. Enos could not think of a ladylike answer to that question, so she countered with one of her own. How did you know about the silk and the dragons? I saw you on the road. You were clutching it as if you thought all imperial armies would be trying to snatch it from you. You went by me at a tremendous rate. Her father chuckled and gestured for her to sit. Like the time you befuddled the customs men in Jalpuso, Sagorn? Sagorn guffawed and folded himself back into the chair. More like you and the meat pies. You know, I really would like to see a book about what King Hollandarn went through someday. Those stories sound like stories we just have to hear. Her father laughed in turn. Evidently, these were old adventures that Enos would not be invited to share. Now he had produced a decanter of dwarfish cut crystal that she had only seen once or twice before, and 3 of the precious matching goblets. 3! To her astonishment, she found herself sitting on the edge of the sofa and holding one of the goblets. Sagorn must have noticed her surprise, and her father had noticed that he had noticed. I think Enos has earned this, he said. Sip, my dear, it's powerful. Sagorn sipped and sighed. Superb. I would not have expected this in Krasnagar. Elvish, of course. The king smiled. Valdequif itself. Cade bought a cask of it from Kinvale. I hoard it like a dwarf. He was answering a question that had not been asked. Obviously, Sagorn and he knew each other well. Enos felt a little reassured and sipped at her drink. She did not care for the taste, like drinking nettles, and the fumes burned the inside of her nose. But certainly it was an honor, and a sign of forgiveness. She felt very grown up. Bit more than that, she has obviously not had any kind of liquor, and it sounds like very strong stuff. Now, Enos, her father said, settling back in his chair, tell Dr. Sagorn about the god. God? The eagle's eyes flashed to her again. Enos related her experience once more. When she was done, she thought she had managed to maintain a very matter-of-fact decorum. There was a long silence. Sagorn scratched at his cheek in deep thought. He emptied his goblet. Her father rose and refilled it. Had the god not come, Hollandarn, what would you have done? She had never heard anyone except her mother and Cade call her father by name like that. Her father shrugged at the question. Given my daughter a hard scolding, sent Mayo a couple of crowns, and dispatched Unanini out of here on the first boat. The old man nodded, then smiled mockingly. The silk would have stayed in the chapel then? I do not steal from gods. Quite. The silk seems unimportant. If the gods did not want this chaplain woman to return to the Empire, they could have found a simpler way to produce this effect, I should think. Sagorn turned his calculating eyes on Enos again. So the message to you seems to be the important part. But gods do not meddle in trivial matters. Are you in love at the moment, young lady? Enos felt herself turn very pink. No, of course not. Hardly, her father protested mildly. Yeah, her dad would. Any dad would. Sagorn sent him an odd glance. So she is going to fall in love. She will have a choice to make? Highness, has your father ever explained the importance of Krasnagar? Enos shook her head dumbly. Well, Krasnagar is very unusual. You have Jotnar here and you have imps. There are very few places in all Pandemia where that combination exists in peace. Did you ever hear of the mad sorcerer? She shook her head, surprised at the sudden shift in subject. It's a name that was given to Eniso. Does it not seem strange that a man of such vast power would choose to build his tower in a barren, isolated spot like Krasnagar? But he was not so crazy as he seemed, I think. This is a very strategic little town. It has only good harbor in the north. Why was he telling her this? He seemed very solemn. Enos glanced at her father, and he frowned as if to tell her to listen carefully. Both Nordland and the Empire think they should own Krasnagar. Is that not so, Majesty? It has always been so. And it has always had a king, not a queen regnant, Sagorn said triumphantly. So you see, Highness, the Thanes and the Empire will all take a great deal of interest in whoever you choose as husband. Yet they both need you. Need me? she asked. Us? He nodded. Need Krasnagar. There is much your father must teach you if you are to rule here after him. Salt, for instance. Even humble things like salt. The Jotnar need salt to store their meat over the winter. Salt doesn't sail well, so most of it comes overland from the south in the summer to Krasnagar. Goblins and Jotnar trade furs for it. The Empire wants the furs. Things like that. The Emperor would not like to see a Jotun king in Krasnagar. Nordland wouldn't like you to marry an imp. But they'll both accept me as queen? She protested, looking to her father. She had hardly ever thought about being queen. That would be after he died, and she was not going to think about that. He nodded, a little doubtfully, she thought. If you are old enough and strong enough, and if they approve of your choice of husband. Most husbands like to give orders, you know. She snorted, not caring that snorting was not regal. I wouldn't have cared either. Well, that doesn't have to be for years yet, does it? For just a moment, then he seemed to change his mind. I certainly hope not. What I think my learned friend is saying, though, is that you may have to choose a husband quite soon, in a year or two even, and your decision will be important to very many people. The god was telling you to remember love when you decide. A divine hint, right, Sagorn? Eno spoke first, suddenly seized by a horrible doubt. You're not going to marry me off to some horrible old duke, are you, father? Her father laughed. Not unless you want me to. No, Nordland would not stand for it anyway. That's what I mean. Your decision might start a war, Enos. She gasped at such a horrible idea and swallowed the last of whatever it was in her glass. It made her cough. If enjoying this vile stuff was a requirement for adulthood, then she had farther to go than she thought. Her father rose. I'll send for some lunch, Sagorn, unless you prefer the hall. It was a hint of dismissal for Enos, and Enos had still not settled the terrible matter of the silk. No, a snack here would be fine, the old man said with a strange smile at her father. As you know, sire, I am not much of a party man. Tonight, perhaps, though, I understand that we have a very fine minstrel visiting us. Kate is organizing something. Enos was being edged to the door. Father, the silk? He looked surprised, then laughed loudly again. 3.5 imperials, you said. She nodded, miserably, and he laid heavy hands on her shoulders. Enos, darling, that much would buy Mayo's whole stock. Mayo? He smiled and perhaps blushed a little. Mayo and I are very old friends. You used to play with the servants' children when you were little. So did I. I've known Mayo all my life. I even thought I was in love with her once. Who went with you this morning? He asked, suddenly suspicious. She confessed, no one. He sighed and patted her shoulder. This has to stop, Enos. You're growing up. You're not a child anymore. You can't run around by yourself. And looks like that ends our time together. Thank you so much for spending your time with me and joining me on this adventure. Please remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to be notified about new videos. If you like my content, please join me at my Patreon page. Link is below. This is Tarynn, and until our next adventure, keep reading.